Welcome. This is a paper connections investigation. I want you to imagine, if you will, that you are a historian. You are digging through a dusty, poorly lit archive in northeastern France.
Right. A very typical archival setting for this kind of research.
Exactly. And you open a leather-bound folder. Inside, you find yourself holding a piece of paper from the year 1808. It is a business letter. It is written in this very rigid, pre-standardized Old German.
And looking at the translation of this document, it reads like the most mundane commercial correspondence imaginable.
It really does. The author is essentially complaining about some prices being too high. He states he has found a better supplier locally, and he coldly cancels any prospect of a business deal for the foreseeable future.
Just a polite, firm rejection.
Right, just a no thank you, the kind of thing you would skim and immediately throw into the discard pile.
Precisely. If you were quickly auditing a 19th century merchant's records, your eyes would just glaze right over it. It reads perfectly as standard, early 19th century commercial correspondence.
But the notes we have today suggest you shouldn't throw this paper away. The source material claims the single boring rejection letter is actually a highly coded smuggling manifest.
It is.
That it connects a very famous luxury champagne brand to Napoleon Bonaparte's secret postal censors, to underground Russian spy networks, and incredibly to the private art vaults of the Tsar of Russia.
Yes.
How does a basic no thank you note do all of that?
To understand that, we have to look past the ink on the page. We have to examine the entire ecosystem surrounding this document.
Right.
We are not just looking at a failed business transaction. We are looking at a masterclass in espionage. We are looking at the survival of a female-led business operating in the crosshairs of global economic warfare.
Today, we are taking you with us as we unpack a truly incredible piece of research. Our mission today is to decode this single 1808 letter.
Indeed.
And by figuring out the mechanics of how this letter worked, we are going to reveal the sheer audacity, the physical danger, and the hidden history behind the rise of the Veuve Clicquot champagne empire.
It is a staggering narrative.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the article suggests that before we even read the words, the physical paper itself is a massive red flag. What are we missing here?
Well, let's start with the postal forensics. When you examine the original artifact, you see a specific set of stamps and markings.
Okay.
This letter was deposited on August 27, 1808 at the Bureau Impérial de France in Lubeck.
Lubeck. Let's do a geography check for the listener. Where exactly is that, and why does it matter in 1808?
Lubeck is a port city on the Baltic Sea in what is modern-day Germany. Historically, it was the capital of the Hanseatic League.
Which was a very powerful trading bloc.
Exactly. It was a massive confederation of merchant guilds and market towns that dominated Baltic maritime trade for centuries. They controlled the flow of goods between Eastern and Western Europe.
But by 1808, that political landscape had changed.
It had violently shifted. Lubeck was occupied by French forces under Napoleon. So the post office where this letter was dropped off wasn't just a neutral mail carrier. The Bureau Impérial de France was a primary instrument of imperial surveillance.
Meaning Napoleon's people are the ones processing, stamping, and routing this piece of mail.
Precisely. Napoleon maintained a sophisticated surveillance system known as the Cabinet Noir, or the Black Chamber.
I see.
Postmasters were effectively intelligence agents. They had specialized techniques to melt wax seals, read the contents, copy anything suspicious, and reseal the letters without the sender or recipient ever knowing.
So if you are sending mail through a French-occupied Hanseatic port during wartime, you have to assume the emperor's spies are reading every single syllable.
You absolutely do, and that makes the cost of sending this letter even more curious.
The source notes a specific postage charge of 19 décimes. I assume that is expensive for the time.
Extremely expensive. To give you some context on the mechanics of early 19th century postal systems, envelopes as we know them didn't really exist yet.
People just folded the paper.
Yes, people wrote on a sheet of paper, folded the paper in on itself, and sealed it with wax. The postal tariffs were calculated not just by distance, but by the number of sheets in the packet.
Okay.
A standard single-sheet letter traveling the distance from Lubeck to northeastern France should have cost around 8 to 10 décimes.
So a 19 décime charge means this wasn't just a quick note. This was a thick, multi-page packet of documents.
It was heavy. It likely contained ledgers, multiple missives, or financial drafts. But the most glaring piece of physical evidence, the thing that would make any attentive French censor instantly suspicious, is the material the letter is written on.
The paper itself, the article mentions a watermark. Walk us through that.
Right. If you take this specific historical document and hold it up to a light source, you will see a papermaker's signature pressed directly into the fibers. It reads, J. Watman ST06.
Okay, so a man named Whatman made the paper 2 years prior. Why is that a problem for the French authorities?
Because James Whatman operated the turkey mill in Maidstone, Kent. Exactly. Which is in England. This isn't just any paper. This is premium British wove paper, or papier vellum.
How does that differ from continental paper?
At the time, most paper was laid paper, made on a mold with wide wire screens that left visible, ribbed grid lines on the page. Whatman had pioneered a technique using a fine, woven brass wire mesh.
Creating a smoother surface.
Yes, it produced the smoothest, finest, most uniform paper stock available in the world.
So let me get this straight. We have a letter sitting in a French-occupied port, stamped by Napoleon's imperial postal system at the absolute height of Napoleon's blockade against all British goods.
Right.
And the smuggler is casually writing their correspondence on premium, easily identifiable British luxury paper.
The medium itself is illicit. It is physical evidence of cross-channel smuggling before the censor even bothers to read the ink.
That is astounding.
It proves that despite Napoleon's massive military blockade, British goods were still flowing into these occupied Hanseatic ports.
It's akin to using a highly encrypted, completely illegal app to communicate with a cartel, but the app itself was created by the very authorities trying to catch you, and you're just flaunting it.
It is a brazen display.
You are writing your secret codes on contraband. It shows a complete disregard for the blockade on multiple levels.
And there is a profound historical irony to this that the researchers point out. Napoleon Bonaparte was the architect of the blockade that made this paper illegal.
Right, he created the conditions.
He was the reason this smuggler had to operate in the shadows. Yet years later, when Napoleon was finally defeated and exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, he sat down to write his own last will and testament.
Let me guess.
Yes. The paper he used to write his final wishes was this exact same premium British wove paper.
That is an incredible historical footnote. The man who forced Veuve Clicquot into the shadows ends his life writing on the very paper her operatives were using to bypass his laws.
It shows you that luxury and utility will always find a way past a border wall.
It really does. But let's move from the physical paper to the actual words. If the French censors are opening mail, what exactly are they reading when they melt the wax on this 1808 letter?
They read a letter addressed to the firm of Clicquot Fourneau & Co. in Reims, France. The author signs off as a merchant named Paul Marache.
Okay.
And the main body in the text goes out of its way to establish a lack of connection.
How so?
Marache writes that he received a previous letter, complains bitterly that the champagne prices offered are far too high, states he has purchased wine from a different source because of local necessity, and concludes by saying there is simply no business to be done between them for the year.
It is the ultimate deflection. If I am a French spy opening this, I see a disgruntled buyer cutting ties.
Exactly. There is no actionable intelligence.
There are no troop movements, no smuggling routes detailed. It looks like a complete dead end. But the article says the facade drops at the very end of the document. How does the code actually work?
A censor is generally looking for broad strokes of subversion. But Marache couldn't just send a completely empty letter. He had a mission.
He had to communicate real logistics.
Precisely. He had to actually pass along critical updates to the team back in France. He does this with two highly specific, seemingly casual mentions slipped into the final sentences.
Okay, looking at the translation here, I see the first one. He is explaining why a previous piece of mail was delayed, and he casually drops a name. He says he didn't get the letter routed to Paris because he was, quote, at Mr. Lebensky's.
Yes.
I know we're going to come back to that name because the source material frames it as an explosive reveal. But what is the second slip?
The second slip is in the closing sign-off. After spending the entire letter saying he will not be doing business with them, he adds this postscript.
What does it say?
As regards the wines that my associate has received, if the goods have arrived in good condition, I will settle immediately with Mr. Bone upon my arrival.
Mr. Bone. Why does that name matter to the investigation?
Because Mr. Bone is Louis Bone. He was the principal commercial agent and head of sales for Veuve Clicquot.
So he is the mastermind of their export operations.
He is their master smuggler. And when historians look for Paul Marache, the man who supposedly wrote this rejection letter, they find nothing.
No records at...
None. Marache leaves zero historical footprint. There is no record of his firm in the archives of Lubeck, nor in the ledgers of Reims. The consensus is that Marache was a phantom.
So he didn't exist.
Right. He was either a local commission agent acting as a blind, or it was simply a pseudonym used by Louis Bone himself to safely write back to headquarters.
So the entire letter is a Trojan horse. The complaints about prices are just filler text.
Exactly.
The real message to the team in France is hidden in those two sentences. It essentially says, I have made contact with our highly placed target, the shipment is moving safely, and I will handle the financial settlement when I return.
That is the real manifest.
Yeah.
The rest is just theater for the censors.
Okay, but to really grasp why Louis Bone is risking his life sending coded letters from the freezing Baltic coast, we need to understand the stakes back in France. We need to talk about the woman he was writing to.
Yes, we have to talk about the widow, Barbara Nicole Ponsardin.
The source material paints a fascinating picture of her early life. She is born in 1777 in Reims, which is the heart of the Champagne region.
Right.
Her father, Nicolas Jean Ponsardin, is a very wealthy, very shrewd textile merchant, and he manages to survive the absolute bloodbath of the French Revolution by constantly adapting his politics.
He's a survivor.
He is a royalist one day, a Jacobin the next, whatever it takes to keep his head attached to his neck, and he raises his daughter to understand that reading the room, social capital, and absolute pragmatism are literally matters of life and death.
It's a harsh education, but a vital one for the era. She learns early on that ideological purity is a luxury, survival is the priority.
And how does she enter the wine business?
In 1798, she marries François Clicquot. The Clicquot family is primarily involved in banking and textiles, much like her father, but they have this side project. They had recently started a small wine merchant business.
And Barbara Nicole doesn't just sit in the parlor while her husband works. She is highly involved.
Far from it. Both Barbara Nicole and François are deeply hands-on. They travel out to the Grand Cru villages, places like Bouzy and Verzenay.
They're essentially learning the trade from the ground up.
Yes, they are walking the vineyards, talking to the growers, working the harvests. They are actively learning the temperamental, highly volatile chemistry of early 19th century winemaking. They're building this business side by side.
But then, tragedy strikes. In 1805, Francois suddenly falls ill and dies.
A devastating blow.
The sources say it might have been typhoid, it might have been depression. Historians aren't entirely sure. But the result is catastrophic. Barbara Nicole is 27 years old. She is suddenly a widow. She has a young daughter, Clementine. And she is staring down massive debt from a half-built wine business that her husband's family now wants to liquidate.
To fully understand her predicament, you have to look at the legal and social mechanics of France in 1805.
The social expectations were rigid.
Very rigid.
Yeah.
Society had an uncompromising script for a woman in her position. You grieve, you let the men in the family arrange your financial affairs, and you step back into domestic obscurity.
Because the law essentially required it, right?
Okay.
We hear about the Napoleonic Code all the time, but how did it actually impact a woman's daily life?
The Napoleonic Code, which was promulgated in 1804, completely reshaped French civil law, and its overarching effect on gender was to aggressively enforce a paternalistic society.
Right.
It utilized a concept somewhat akin to coverture in English common law. When a woman married, her legal identity was essentially subsumed by her husband.
Meaning she had no individual legal standing.
Exactly. She could not sign a legal contract. She could not initiate a lawsuit. She could not open a bank account in her own name. She could not even control the property she brought into the marriage.
So if you are a married woman with a brilliant idea for a business, you legally cannot execute it without your husband's signature.
You are, for all intents and purposes, a legal minor. But the architects of the Napoleonic Code left one massive, glaring loophole in the text.
And that was widowhood.
Widowhood. The legal status of the veuve, the widow, was an anomaly. It was originally designed to ensure that a widow could manage an estate just long enough to pass it down to her male heirs.
Right, to preserve the patriarchal line.
Yes, but the unintended consequence was that a widow was in one of the very few legal states in 19th century France where a woman could actually exercise full financial agency.
That is fascinating.
As a widow, Barbara Nicole could suddenly own property. She could enter into legally binding contracts. She could borrow money. She could run a commercial enterprise in her own name.
Okay, I want the listener to really pause and imagine the gravity of this for a second. If Barbara Nicole had bowed to social pressure and simply remarried to save her finances, which would have been the easiest, safest route for a 27-year-old mother in debt Veuve Clicquot, as a brand would literally not exist.
If she remarries, the new husband immediately takes legal control of the vineyards, the cellars, and the inventory.
The logo on.
The brand, the legacy of innovation, the global empire, it all vanishes into the ledger books of some textile merchant.
Instead, she walks right through that legal loophole. She goes to her father-in-law, Veuve Clicquot, and says, "Do not liquidate this company. Let me run the wine business."
And he agrees to fund her, but he imposes severe conditions. He forces her to take on a seasoned male commercial partner. He brings in Alexandre Jerome Fourneau.
So she still has to compromise.
This was the price of entry. The conservative banking community and the deeply patriarchal merchant networks of Europe were not going to lend money to a solo female proprietor. She needed a male figurehead to appease the creditors.
Which explains the address on our letter.
Exactly. That is why our 1808 coded letter from the Baltic is specifically addressed to Veuve Clicquot Fourneau and C.
She had the legal power, but she still had to play the societal game. And just for continuity, the source notes that this partnership was actually temporary. They split amicably in 1810, and Fourneau's family goes on to found Champagne Taittinger, which is a massive brand in its own right today.
Right.
So she eventually gets to fly completely solo. But in 1808, when this letter is written, she is deep in the trenches, and Napoleon decides to make doing business nearly impossible.
Yes. In November of 1806, Napoleon issues the Berlin Decree. This is the official start of the Continental Blockade.
And this wasn't just a minor tariff dispute over luxury goods. This was total asymmetrical economic warfare.
Yeah.
How did the blockade actually function?
You have to picture the military reality of the era. Great Britain ruled the oceans. The Royal Navy was unmatched. France, under Napoleon, ruled the European landmass.
An elephant fighting a whale.
Precisely. Since Napoleon couldn't defeat the British Navy at sea, he decided to bankrupt them by cutting off their access to European markets. The Berlin Decree declared that every single port across the European continent under French control or allied with France was strictly closed to British ships, British goods, and any neutral vessel that had even called at a British harbor.
If you crossed the line, customs officials would seize your ship, burn your cargo, and potentially imprison your crew.
It effectively halted global maritime trade. And while it did hurt Britain, it absolutely devastated the French export economy.
It backfired on the French merchants.
Significantly.
Huh.
French export revenues crashed by nearly a third within 2 years. Major port cities like Bordeaux and Marseille were economically paralyzed.
For a luxury wine house like Veuve Clicquot, this is an existential threat, because the domestic market in France was essentially dead, right?
It was a fraction of what it had been. The French aristocracy, the traditional consumers of luxury champagne, had been severely depleted by the guillotine during the Revolution and the subsequent decades of war.
The wealth was gone.
Yes, the traditional domestic wealth was gone.
And what little domestic market was left was completely monopolized by her chief rival, Jean-Remy Moet. Why? Because Moet just happened to be close personal friends with Napoleon Bonaparte.
Exactly. They had met years earlier at a military academy in Brienne.
So Moet has the emperor's ear, he has the domestic contracts, and Barbara Nicole is boxed out. She has no buyers at home, and the oceans are blocked by the British and the French. She has to pivot, and she pivots incredibly hard to Russia.
The Russian imperial court was the holy grail of the luxury market. They had loved French champagne since the days of Catherine the Great.
But what is truly fascinating about this pivot is the physical reality of the product. The wine they were shipping to St. Petersburg in the early 1800s was fundamentally different from what we drink today.
Fundamentally different. Let's discuss the mechanics of champagne à la Russe. Today we expect champagne to be crisp, dry, perhaps a brut.
Right.
But the Russian palate demanded an extraordinarily high sugar content. We're talking about 200 to 300 grams of residual sugar per liter.
To give the listener some context on that level of sweetness, a standard can of modern cola has roughly 100 grams of sugar per liter.
Exactly. So this wine was 2 to 3 times sweeter than modern soda.
It wouldn't even flow like wine. The viscosity would be closer to maple syrup or a heavy, rich liqueur.
It was essentially an alcoholic syrup.
Hmm.
But Barbara Nicole didn't judge the palate. She engineered her product to meet the demand.
She adapted.
She knew exactly what her target demographic desired, and she formulated her cuvées specifically for that intense sweetness.
But having the right product is one thing. Actually getting it to Russia during a continent-wide blockade is a logistical nightmare. In 1806, they attempt a massive shipment.
Yes.
They try to move 50,000 bottles through the port of Amsterdam, hoping to sneak it up the coast to the Baltic.
And the result is a catastrophic multi-layered disaster. The British Navy blockades the port of Amsterdam, The ships can't leave.
So the cargo is stranded.
The wine is unloaded and trapped in these poorly ventilated, sweltering warehouses along the canals during the peak heat of summer.
And because of that intense heat, the wine suffers from something the source calls turning ropey. What is actually happening inside the bottle when wine turns ropey?
It's a deeply unpleasant bacterial spoilage. In the heat of the warehouse, a specific type of lactic acid bacteria, like Pediococcus, begins to rapidly multiply in the wine.
Okay.
As these bacteria consume the sugars and nutrients, they synthesize massive amounts of complex carbohydrates, specifically polysaccharides. These long molecular chains bind together and turn the liquid into a thick, slimy, viscous gel.
That is horrifying.
It pours like mucus. It is entirely ruined.
But that wasn't even the worst part. The article notes they were storing a large portion of the shipment not in glass bottles, but in traditional wooden casks. Why is that a problem for champagne?
It comes down to the mechanics of secondary fermentation. Champagne gets its bubbles because living yeast is trapped in a sealed environment with sugar. The yeast eats the sugar and expels carbon dioxide gas and alcohol.
Creating pressure.
Right. In a heavy glass bottle, the glass can contain that massive buildup of atmospheric pressure. But a wooden cask is porous. The staves expand and contract. The pressure builds unevenly.
So the casks start leaking and exploding in the warehouse. Louis Bone, our master smuggler from the letter, was sent to Amsterdam to inspect the damage. He writes back to Barbe Nicole and complains bitterly about the massive, gassy bubbles erupting from the spoiled casks.
Yes, he had a very descriptive phrase for it.
He called them, "You, the crippled toad's eyes." He wrote, "I like large eyes everywhere except in champagne wine."
It is a witty quote, but it underscores a devastating economic reality. That Amsterdam shipment was a crippling financial blow. All that labor, all those raw materials, completely lost.
It almost broke them.
Barbe Nicole was reportedly pushed so close to bankruptcy that she was considering selling her personal jewelry just to keep the company's ledger balanced.
She's completely cornered. Conventional shipping is blockaded. Warehouses are literally rotting her wine. The traditional methods have failed. So she unleashes her secret weapon, Louis Bone.
Louis Bone is a remarkable historical figure. He was a polyglot, a charismatic salesman, and an utterly fearless operative.
He had to be.
During the blockade, he essentially abandoned a normal life. He lived entirely out of horse-drawn carriages. He navigated military checkpoints, constantly shifted aliases, and built a shadowy network of contacts across the Hanseatic cities.
The source notes he was so careful that he never even wrote the word champagne in his correspondence.
Never. He simply referred to it as the goods.
It reminds me of an intricate art heist. Think about the juxtaposition here. You have the most refined, delicate luxury product in Europe. This sweet golden wine is destined for the crystal flutes of the Winter Palace.
Right.
But to get there, it has to physically travel through the grimiest, coldest, most dangerous underworld of Baltic smuggling routes.
The champagne itself remains elegant, but the logistics are pure grit. Bone is loading crates onto small, unmarked boats in the dead of night, trying to avoid the lanterns of French revenue cutters patrolling the coast.
It's extremely perilous.
And when conventional concealment failed, he had to engineer new ways to hide the bottles from customs inspectors.
The source details one of his most brilliant methods. He would hide the champagne bottles inside legally traded bulk barrels of coffee beans. Walk us through how you actually pull that off.
It requires meticulous packing. You take a massive oak barrel designated for coffee. You can't just throw glass bottles in there or they will clink together.
Which would be an immediate giveaway.
A single metallic clink when a customs officer rolls the barrel means you are going to prison. So Bone's operatives had to carefully layer the bottom with sawdust or straw, place the bottles precisely so they wouldn't touch, and then pack raw coffee beans tightly into every single crevice until the barrel was solid.
And the genius of using coffee is the olfactory masking.
Right.
A customs inspector opens the lid to verify the cargo, and he is hit with this overwhelming pungent aroma of unroasted coffee beans.
It completely overwhelms any faint smell of wine or yeast.
And it deters them from digging too deeply into the heavy bulk. It is brilliant mechanical smuggling, but it is incredibly high risk. We mentioned the stakes earlier. In the spring of 1808, just a few months before our encoded letter was mailed, Bone was actually caught.
He was. He was traveling without a proper license deep in Russian territory. He was flagged by the authorities and placed under strict surveillance as a suspected French spy.
The pressure he was under is unimaginable. He writes a desperate letter to Barbe Nicole and tells her point blank, Deportation to the mines of Siberia is the chastisement for all indiscretions.
He is operating every single day under the very real, very imminent threat of the Gulag. One wrong word, one broken bottle, and he is spending the rest of his life doing hard labor in the frozen East.
And yet, he doesn't panic?
No, he adapts. He sits down in Lübeck and writes the polite, non-committal Paul Marash letter, because he knew he had to get the wine not just into the Russian border, but directly onto the Tsar's dining table.
Which brings us back to the most shocking detail in our 1808 letter. How does a suspected French spy, dodging customs agents and hiding wine in coffee barrels, get contraband directly to the Emperor of Russia?
The key is that one name dropped in the middle of a complaint about prices.
Mr. Lubensky. Okay, so this guy casually mentions he was at Mr. Lubensky's. Who is that? Just another merchant?
Not even close. Franz Ivanovich Lubensky was the keeper of the Hermitage Picture Gallery in St. Petersburg. When you realize who this man was, the entire scope of the smuggling operation shifts from the docks to the highest echelons of global power.
And the Hermitage at this time was not a public museum where anyone could just buy a ticket, right?
No, absolutely not. The Hermitage was originally built by Catherine the Great as her strictly private retreat. It was an exclusive complex of pavilions adjoining the Winter Palace.
So he is incredibly highly placed.
Lubensky literally controlled the physical corridors between the Tsar's private living quarters and his massive art vaults. He served as the ultimate gatekeeper under 3 successive Tsars. He decided what art was purchased, how it was framed, and what hung on the walls. He was in constant direct contact with Tsar Alexander I.
If you get your champagne into Lubensky's hands, you aren't just selling a bottle of wine. You are placing it in the most exclusive room in the Russian Empire with the implicit cultural endorsement of the Tsar himself.
Exactly.
But Lubensky wasn't just a powerful social contact. The source suggests he was actually a logistical shield. How does an art curator help a smuggler bypass a military blockade?
We have to look at the timeline. In August 1808, the exact same month our coded letter was written in Lübeck, Lubensky was on a highly sensitive official state mission in Paris.
Okay.
He was working directly alongside Vivant Tenon, the first director of the Louvre, to purchase masterpieces for the Russian imperial collection.
We are talking about massive acquisitions. The source notes he was buying the Giustiniani collection, which included 23 priceless paintings, including a masterpiece by Caravaggio.
Yes, and because Lubensky was moving priceless art on the direct orders of the Tsar, he possessed absolute diplomatic immunity. His shipments moved in massive, heavy wooden crates, protected by imperial mandate and diplomatic seals.
And customs officials, no matter how zealous they are about enforcing Napoleon's blockade, are simply not going to pry open the Tsar's new Caravaggio with a crowbar to look for contraband.
His crates were untouchable.
So let's connect the dots here. The 1808 letter explicitly states that our Veuve Clicquot operative didn't get his mail because he was at Mr. Lubensky's during this precise Paris trip.
The breathtaking hypothesis presented by historians is that Louis Bone was slipping crates of Veuve Clicquot champagne directly into the diplomatic art shipments bound for the Winter Palace.
They were packing bottles of wine underneath the floorboards of the crates, carrying Rembrandts and Caravaggios. That is staggering.
It is a stunning historical hypothesis. And what makes it so incredibly compelling is the absolute silence surrounding it.
There's no paper trail.
None. No official corporate history of Veuve Clicquot mentions Lubensky. He does not exist in their ledger books. There are no receipts. The only place he appears is in this single, intercepted, coded letter.
Which makes perfect sense. If you are piggybacking on the Tsar's diplomatic art shipments to bypass a global embargo, you do not write that down in the company books.
We absolutely do not.
And the article notes that Lubensky was uniquely suited for this because he was famously tight-lipped. There is an anecdote where, years later, a massive fire breaks out in the Winter Palace.
Yes, his reaction was remarkable.
Instead of panicking, Lubensky calmly ordered his staff to brick up the doors to the Hermitage mid-fire to save the art from the smoke and flames. He was incredibly cool under pressure. He was the perfect silent partner for an international smuggling ring.
By reaching Lubensky, Bone essentially bypassed the entire Continental Blockade. He used the absolute highest level of diplomatic immunity to move a luxury good.
It's an incredible circumvention.
This clandestine, high-stakes network is what kept the company financially alive during its darkest, most perilous years.
It kept them alive, yes, but they were still just surviving in the shadows. The ultimate turning point, the moment Veuve Clicquot goes from a struggling, surviving business to a global legend, happens a few years later in 1814.
The geopolitical winds finally shift. Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia severely weakens his grip on Europe. The armies of the Sixth Coalition, which includes massive contingents of the Russian army, push west, crossing the borders into France.
And in the spring of 1814, Russian troops physically occupy the city of Reims. I want you to really picture the terror of this moment. You are a French winemaker in 1814.
The enemy is at the gates.
And occupying hostile foreign army troops who have been fighting brutal campaigns across Europe has just marched into your city. What is the standard operating procedure for a business owner?
Most producers in Champagne did exactly what you would expect. They panicked. The region is famous for its crayères, the massive, deep chalk cellars dug by the Romans.
Right.
The winemakers rushed into these caves and hastily built false walls. They painstakingly hid their best vintages behind freshly constructed brick-and-mortar partitions. Their logic was simple and entirely rational. If the occupying troops can't see the wine, they can't loot it.
But what did Barbe Nicole do when the Russian army arrived at her gates?
She did the unthinkable. She threw open the cellar doors.
She didn't hide a single bottle. She actively invited the occupying soldiers in.
She is quoted as saying a phrase that has become legendary in business history. Today they drink, tomorrow they will pay.
It sounds almost mythic, but when you break down the strategy, it is profoundly clear-eyed and brilliant. She looked at these hostile Russian troops and didn't just see looters. She saw her ultimate target demographic.
Precisely. Who were the officers commanding these regiments? They were the sons, the cousins, the younger brothers of the Russian aristocracy.
They were the exact same families that Louis Bone and Mr. Lubensky had been smuggling wine to for the past 8 years.
She was essentially hosting the most aggressive, high-stakes marketing campaign in history. She allowed them to drink her inventory, effectively giving free samples of the very wine she had been painstakingly engineering for their palate.
And there is a fascinating, almost cinematic cultural footnote to this specific occupation in Reims that the source brings up. This exact moment in history is what birthed the art of sabrage.
Yes. I love the mechanics of this detail.
For anyone who doesn't know, sabrage is the act of opening a champagne bottle by taking a sword and violently slicing the top of the glass neck cleanly off. How did that actually start?
It started out of sheer logistical necessity. These Russian cavalry officers, the Hussars and the Cossacks, were drinking Clicquot while still mounted on their horses in the streets of Reims.
Right.
You can't easily hold a delicate champagne flute, untwist the wire cage, and gently pop a cork while simultaneously managing the reins of a warhorse.
So they applied military efficiency to luxury consumption.
Exactly. They simply drew their heavy cavalry sabers, found the seam of the glass bottle, and struck the neck with the blunt edge of the blade. The physics of the internal pressure combined with the strike causes the glass ring holding the cork to cleanly snap off.
And then they just poured the foaming wine straight from the jagged mouth of the bottle down their throats.
It's this incredible image. The most elegant luxury good in Europe, consumed with raw, violent military efficiency. And Barbara Nicole just watched them do it, knowing exactly what she was building.
Her strategy worked flawlessly.
It set the stage for the most lucrative post-war gamble in the history of luxury goods. In April 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte finally abdicates. The empire falls, and the Continental Blockade is instantly lifted.
Yeah, the oceans are open again.
Yes, the oceans are finally open.
And Barbara Nicole is ready. She doesn't wait for the political dust to settle. She doesn't wait for her competitors to organize their shipping ledgers. She immediately takes her exceptional 1811 vintage, which is famous in the wine world as the comet year vintage, because a massive comet was visible in the sky during a summer heat wave that produced incredibly ripe grapes.
A legendary vintage.
And she loads it onto a Dutch vessel called the Zes Gebroeders.
And who is on board to oversee this monumental shipment? Louis Bone.
Of course it is. The master smuggler is finally able to sail legally. They race across the Baltic Sea to beat every single other French competitor to the market. They arrive in Königsberg on July 3rd, 1814.
And the source notes they made the journey without a single broken bottle.
An incredible logistical feat in its own right.
And they find that the market is already primed to explode. The Russian cavalry officers who had been drinking for free in her chalk cellars in Reims had already rotated home to St. Petersburg and Moscow.
They had spread the word.
They had told their families, their peers, and the royal court about the incredible wine they drank in France. The brand awareness was at an absolute fever pitch.
Louis Bone writes this incredibly triumphant report back to Barbe Nicole. He says the wine was, quote, as strong as the wines of Hungary, as yellow as gold, and as sweet as nectar.
I loved it.
The Russian buyers literally called it an assassin because it was so potent, so sweet, and so perfectly crafted to their tastes.
And because of that unprecedented demand and the absolute scarcity of the product, Barbe Nicole charged an astronomical price. She set the cost at 5.5 francs a bottle.
To put 5.5 francs into context, that was roughly the equivalent of a skilled vineyard laborer's entire weekly wage for one single bottle of wine.
It was pure luxury pricing.
And the Russians couldn't get enough of it. Bone wrote back that he was practically bored of just sitting at his desk watching people hand him stacks of money. Tsar Alexander Veit, the very man whose art shipments they had secretly piggybacked on years earlier, declared publicly that he would drink nothing else.
Within a decade, Veuve Clicquot isn't just a successful company. It is immortalized in the cultural fabric of Russia. The champagne is name-checked in the foundational literature of the nation, appearing in the poetry of Alexander Pushkin and the stories of Nikolai Gogol.
Which really makes you step back and consider the origins of modern business.
Yeah.
How much of what we consider modern luxury branding was born right here in the mind of this 31-year-old woman in 1808?
If you look closely, it is the exact same playbook used by modern conglomerates today. Unyielding, extreme quality control, artificial scarcity, astronomical pricing that turns the product into a status symbol,
Right.
and the ultimate cultural endorsement by royalty and the global elite. Modern luxury houses spend billions to manufacture that aura, but Barbe Nicole Clicquot was pioneering these strategies in real time while actively dodging an emperor's military blockade and fighting off bankruptcy.
And it all traces back to that one seemingly boring piece of paper, the 1808 letter, a document meticulously designed to look like a merchant's commercial disappointment, but which was actually the lifeblood of a female-led empire.
It was the physical tether connecting a widow in Rheims, a smuggler freezing in the Baltic ports, and the private, untouchable art galleries of the Winter Palace.
It leaves you with a sobering, profound reflection on the nature of history and commerce. The next time you are at a wedding or a celebration and you see a bottle of Veuve Clicquot being poured, take a second to look at that famous yellow label.
Look closely at the word Veuve, the widow, and her name, Ponsardin.
It is so easy to just see it as a generic symbol of celebration or wealth. But think about the invisible history trapped inside that bottle. Think about the clandestine espionage, the heat of the Amsterdam warehouses, the bottles packed tightly into coffee barrels.
The constant looming threat of the Siberian mines.
Think about the brilliant, ruthless patience of a 31-year-old widow who looked at a Napoleonic legal system designed entirely to strip her of agency, found the single narrow loophole, and used it to outmaneuver the most powerful emperor in the world.
Luxury isn't just about the taste of the wine. It's about the sheer, undeniable will required to put it in the glass.
It is a testament to survival through innovation. Before we wrap up, the source text for today's dive actually hints at another massive twist in the Clicquot saga.
It does.
Apparently, by 1827, there is a global banking crisis that threatens to tear the whole monopoly down, forcing the company to pivot yet again. But that is a story for another deep dive. Thank you for joining us on this investigation into the shadows of the 19th century champagne trade.
We hope you never look at a broken wax seal or a glass of champagne the same way again.
We started today talking about how we expect a historical document to be clean and binary, a rejection letter or an acceptance, a failure or a success.
But history is rarely clean.
No. As we've seen today, when you step into the world of Barbe Nicole Clicquot, that clean binary vanishes. You are looking at a landscape that is murky, dangerous, and incredibly beautifully coded. Cheers to the widow.